Welcome to Indonesia Political Focus, your monthly audio briefing on key political developments in Indonesia. This episode covers September 2025, a month that proved politically turbulent for President Prabowo Subianto's administration, marked by significant governance challenges and mounting public pressure. This month's key developments include two cabinet reshuffles, the nationwide #BubarkanDPR protest movement, the largest since Reformasi 1998, and the controversial cancellation of the joint fact-finding team investigating protest violence. These unfolded as President Prabowo made his United Nations General Assembly debut, emphasizing Palestinian statehood and climate action while facing domestic accountability crises. The month also saw the KPK leadership reshuffle, sparking widespread controversy, and the emergence of judicial reform debates threatening institutional independence. In this episode, we'll explore how President Prabowo navigated executive reshuffles and protest demands, examine the legislative reforms emerging from public pressure, analyze the shifting power dynamics as opposition voices strengthen, and assess what these signal for Indonesia's trajectory toward the 2026 elections. Let's get started. September 2025 was characterized by political turbulence and defined by executive consolidation amid rising accountability demands. The administration faced its most significant domestic pressure since taking office, with civil society, opposition parties, and student movements coalescing around anti-corruption and transparency themes. Key political themes include the prioritization of loyalty over expertise in cabinet appointments, the strengthening of opposition voices led by PDIP and AHY, and the emergence of unprecedented social media activism around accountability. The month began with the controversial KPK leadership reshuffle on September 1st, triggering the #KPKIndependent and setting the tone for sustained public pressure. These events connect to broader trends, including growing public skepticism toward established institutions and the rise of digital-first political mobilization. A particularly noteworthy development was the scale and persistence of the #BubarkanDPR movement, with hashtags like BubarkanDPR and EtikaDPR generating 120,000 posts by September 25th, and KPK Independent reaching 150,000 posts. This represents the largest sustained digital protest movement since the 1998 Reformasi period. What proved particularly telling was how social media activism translated into concrete legislative responses, forcing the DPR to abolish housing allowances and suspend overseas trips within days of the protests gaining momentum. The juxtaposition between international diplomatic success and domestic political pressure created a complex narrative. While President Prabowo's UNGA debut was diplomatically successful, with commitments to deploy 20,000 peacekeepers and advocate for Palestinian statehood, domestic critics like WALHI dismissed his climate pledges as disconnected from actual policy. This disconnect between international positioning and domestic accountability became a recurring theme throughout September. Perhaps most significant was the sharp decline in President Prabowo's approval rating, which dropped to 56 to 58.9%, according to SMRC polling, by September 25th, down from 79.3% in January. Turning to the presidency, President Prabowo's September began with significant administrative controversy when the DPR's selection committee reshaped KPK leadership on September 1st, triggering widespread criticism about executive meddling in anti-corruption efforts. This early controversy set the tone for a month centered on executive restructuring through two significant cabinet reshuffles, on September 8th and 17th, that fundamentally reshaped his administration's leadership structure. The September 8th reshuffle saw the removal of Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati, a move that critics, led by PDIP, viewed as prioritizing loyalty over technical expertise in economic management. The September 17th reshuffle was even more extensive, with 11 new appointments signaling the president's intent to consolidate control over key ministries. These moves were interpreted by opposition parties as evidence of an increasingly centralized decision-making process, with merit-based appointments giving way to political considerations. In response to mounting protest pressure, the president supported DPR reform measures, including the abolition of the controversial 50 million rupiah monthly housing allowance and the suspension of overseas parliamentary trips. However, his administration's most controversial decision was the cancellation of the Joint Fact-Finding Team, or TGPF, investigating protest violence, announced publicly by Coordinating Minister Budi Gunawan on September 15. This decision drew sharp criticism from Komnas HAM and human rights organizations, who condemned it as an abandonment of accountability principles. President Prabowo's Unga debut on September 22 to 23 emphasized Indonesia's commitment to Palestinian statehood, climate action, and expanded peacekeeping operations. He pledged to deploy 20,000 Indonesian peacekeepers globally and positioned Indonesia as a bridge builder between developed and developing nations on climate issues. However, the domestic policy landscape remained challenging. Civil society organizations like WALHI publicly challenged the president's climate commitments at the UN, arguing they were disconnected from Indonesia's continued reliance on coal and weak environmental enforcement. This created an unusual dynamic where international diplomatic success was immediately countered by domestic criticism of policy consistency. What does this mean on the ground? The administration faces a credibility gap between international positioning and domestic governance. The decision to cancel the TGPF while promoting human rights and democracy at the UN created particular tensions with civil society groups and international observers. The relationship with Vice President Gibran also showed signs of evolution, with Gibran's September 20th speech in Solo and his September 26th meeting with Central Java youth groups suggesting an independent political profile. These activities fueled speculation about Gibran's post-Prabowo political ambitions, adding another layer of complexity to executive dynamics. The month also witnessed significant developments in women's political representation, with the caucus Perempuan Parlemen pushing for increased female candidacy in 2026 elections on September 19th. While civil society groups supported the initiative, PKS objected, highlighting ongoing coalition resistance to progressive reform measures. This debate underscores deeper tensions within the governing coalition about social and political modernization. Most significantly, the administration's response to accountability demands remained inconsistent, supporting some DPR reforms while rejecting others, creating ongoing friction with protest movements and civil society organizations that continued to plan demonstrations, including the pivotal September 28th protests expected to follow this reporting period. Regional dynamics also emerged as a concern, with West Papua's governor demanding autonomy assurances amid fiscal decentralization disputes, prompting the dispatch of a special envoy on September 20th. Analyzing the intricate web of power, September witnessed significant shifts in coalition dynamics and opposition positioning. The cabinet reshuffles underscored President Prabowo's move toward loyalty-first governance, with traditional technocratic appointments giving way to political considerations. This executive centralization created ripple effects across the broader political system. The opposition underwent notable recalibration during this period. Ahaya emerged as a vocal critic, leading a September 22 Jakarta rally demanding KPK autonomy that drew significant youth and civil society support. His positioning suggests a strategic pivot toward becoming the primary opposition voice for younger demographics, particularly those concerned with anti-corruption issues. PDIP leader Megawati Soekarnoputri's September 25th speech, urging institutional integrity, marked a significant escalation in opposition rhetoric. Her intervention represented her strongest criticism of the Prabowo administration to date, signaling PDIP's transition from constructive opposition to more assertive resistance. This shift carries particular weight given Megawati's historical role and PDIP's continued organizational strength. Behind the headlines, civil society organizations like Comnas Ham, Contra S, and WALHI effectively led accountability demands, often overshadowing formal opposition parties in setting the political agenda. This represents a significant development where non-governmental actors are driving political discourse more effectively than traditional party politics. Coalition dynamics showed signs of strain, particularly with PAN and PKS criticism of centralization trends. Golkar's early candidate endorsements for 2026 elections created additional tension with junior coalition partners, suggesting that electoral positioning is already influencing current governance decisions. These early moves by Golkar risk alienating PAN and PKS, potentially weakening the coalition's cohesion as the 2026 elections approach. The Gibran factor emerged as a wild card in executive dynamics. Vice President Gibran's independent youth outreach, particularly his September 20th solo speech and Central Java engagements, suggest political ambitions that may not align perfectly with President Prabowo's timeline or agenda. This creates an unusual situation where the vice president appears to be building an independent political base while still serving in the current administration. Perhaps most significantly, the protest movement demonstrated organizational capacity that surprised many observers. The coordination between student groups, civil society organizations, and digital activists created sustained pressure that forced legislative changes, something formal opposition parties had struggled to achieve. The planned September 28th protests were organized by this informal coalition rather than traditional political parties. Power center analysis reveals that influence is increasingly distributed across formal government institutions, opposition parties, civil society organizations, and digital activist networks. This multipolar dynamic makes governance more complex, but also creates more channels for accountability pressure, a development that may define Indonesian politics through the 2026 electoral cycle. How is the public responding? Public sentiment showed a dramatic shift during September, with President Prabowo's approval rating dropping sharply to 56 to 58.9% by September 25th, according to SMRC polling. This represents a significant decline from 79.3% in January, indicating that public opinion has shifted substantially as the administration moved from campaign promises to governing realities. Social media amplified accountability demands in unprecedented ways. The hashtag #BubarkanDPR became a rallying point for anti-corruption sentiment, while hashtag EtikaDPR generated 120,000 posts by September 25th, largely mocking the DPR's transparency campaign efforts. The hashtag KPK Independent reached 150,000 posts, reflecting deep public concern about the independence of Indonesia's Anti-Corruption Commission. In terms of civil action, the protest movement that began with demands to dissolve the DPR evolved into a broader accountability campaign focused on judicial reform, police accountability, and anti-corruption measures. The movement is characterized as the largest protest wave since Reformasi 1998, indicating historical levels of public dissatisfaction with institutional performance. The DPR's attempt at damage control, including a September 26th transparency campaign on social media, largely backfired, deepening public cynicism rather than rebuilding trust. The response was overwhelmingly skeptical, with citizens questioning the sincerity of transparency efforts from an institution widely viewed as corrupt and self-serving. Student organizations played a crucial role, though divisions emerged between BEM-SI and independent campus alliances by late September, raising concerns about protest movement cohesion. These internal dynamics will be critical to watch as they affect the movement's ability to maintain sustained pressure on political institutions. So, what's the mood on the street? Growing public frustration with institutional performance is combined with increased willingness to use digital platforms for political mobilization. The September 27th Yogyakarta rally demanding judicial transparency demonstrated ongoing momentum despite concerns about protest fatigue and government efforts to limit demonstrations. The public response suggests a significant shift from passive support to active engagement with accountability issues, marking a potential turning point in Indonesian civil society's relationship with political institutions. On the international stage, President Prabowo's UNGA debut from September 22nd to 23rd showcased Indonesia's diplomatic ambitions while highlighting domestic policy contradictions. His address emphasized three key themes: Palestinian statehood advocacy, climate action commitments, and expanded peacekeeping operations, positioning Indonesia as a bridge between developed and developing nations. The president's pledge to deploy 20,000 Indonesian peacekeepers globally represents a significant expansion of Indonesia's UN peacekeeping commitment, building on the country's growing role in international security operations. This positioning aligns with Indonesia's broader strategy of enhancing its profile as a middle power capable of contributing to global stability. However, the climate commitments faced immediate domestic criticism. WLHI, Indonesia's premier environmental organization, publicly challenged the president's UNGA climate pledges, arguing they were disconnected from Indonesia's continued reliance on coal and weak environmental enforcement. This created an unusual dynamic where international diplomatic positioning was immediately countered by domestic civil society criticism. The UN Human Rights Council's September 26 statement urging dialogue on Indonesia's protest handling added international scrutiny to domestic governance issues. This represents growing reputational risks for the administration, particularly as Western partners increasingly monitor human rights performance alongside economic and security cooperation. Indonesia's ASEAN positioning also faced challenges, with pushback on Myanmar mediation efforts on September 23rd complicating the country's agenda for its upcoming ASEAN 2026 chairmanship. These regional diplomatic difficulties suggest that Indonesia's leadership ambitions in Southeast Asia may face more resistance than anticipated. What does this international positioning mean domestically? The gap between international diplomatic success and domestic accountability challenges may become politically costly. The administration's ability to project competence internationally while facing significant domestic criticism creates a credibility gap that opposition parties and civil society organizations are likely to exploit in future political campaigns. The international dimension adds complexity to domestic political calculations, as global scrutiny of protest handling and governance standards may limit the administration's options for managing civil society pressure. Based on the upcoming agenda, October 2025 will be shaped by several critical developments. The September 28th protests represent a pivotal moment for Indonesia's accountability movement, with civil society organizations, student groups, and opposition parties coordinating what could be the largest demonstration since the cabinet reshuffles began. The judicial reform debate represents a key battleground ahead. Proposals allowing the Ministry of Law and Human Rights to pre-screen judges have sparked alarm among civil society groups, with PDIP and Contra S urging constitutional court review. This could become a defining constitutional battle that shapes the balance between executive power and judicial independence. Coalition stability represents another critical variable. Golkar's early candidate endorsements for 2026 elections risk alienating PAN and PKS, potentially fracturing the governing coalition. The administration's ability to maintain unity while managing electoral positioning will be closely watched as parties begin jockeying for 2026 advantages. Vice President Gibran's independent positioning deserves particular attention. His youth outreach in Central Java and independent political messaging suggest ambitions that may not align with President Prabowo's timeline, creating potential friction within the executive branch. A potential inflection point could be the government's response to ongoing accountability demands. The cancellation of the TGPF continues to drive protest momentum, and the administration's handling of civil society pressure will significantly influence its political standing through 2026. What should you keep an eye on next month? Several key indicators. the scale and impact of planned October protests, the Constitutional Court's response to judicial reform proposals, coalition dynamics as electoral positioning intensifies, and international responses to Indonesia's protest handling. The intersection of domestic accountability pressure and international scrutiny creates a complex political environment where the administration must balance multiple competing demands while maintaining governance effectiveness and electoral viability. So, to recap the main takeaways from September 2025. Firstly, September marked a definitive end to President Prabowo's honeymoon period, with approval ratings dropping 20 points and the largest protest movement since 1998 challenging institutional performance. Secondly, the administration's response to accountability demands, supporting some DPR reforms while canceling the TGPF investigation, created ongoing tensions with civil society and opposition groups that continue to drive mobilization efforts. And finally, the emergence of digital-first political activism, with hashtags like Bubarkan DPR and KPK Independent generating hundreds of thousands of posts, represents a new model of political engagement that traditional parties and institutions are still learning to navigate. The month also highlighted growing contradictions between international diplomatic success and domestic governance challenges, with civil society organizations like WALHI publicly challenging the president's UN commitments as disconnected from actual policy implementation. Thank you for joining Indonesia Political Focus. We'll be back next month with analysis of October's developments, including the critical protest movements and judicial reform debates that will shape Indonesia's political trajectory toward 2026.